All right. Hello, willkommen, bienvenue, konnichiwa, ni hao, jambo, marhaba. It's time for the Armist Inquisition yet again, episode 289 on Sunday, the 16th of July, 2023. I'm Phil.
I'm Ben.
I'm Matt.
And tonight we're very happy to be joined by Terry Boardman from 3man.org. How are you doing, Terry?
Hello, good to be with you again.
Yeah, nice to see you again.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, we had a really interesting discussion last time for those of you who might be new to our show, where we're talking about predominantly Rudolf Steiner and I can never say it, anthroposophy and Araman.
Yeah,
and
right first time.
Just about, I had to think about it. So this time we thought we'd talk about your book, which came out quite recently. Here it is, Western Hostility to Russia. Here's the cover incoming. You can grab this on Amazon. And it's so relevant because of what's going on over in Ukraine at the moment. And so very interested to get your take on what's going on. And I think for people in the UK, in the West, whose diet of news is probably fed via the BBC, Sky News, Channel 4, those sort of outlets, they probably think that Vladimir Putin woke up on the wrong side of bed one day and decided he was just going to invade Ukraine on a whim. And your book sort of sheds a light on a lot of the background that's been going on, not just since like the Maidan coup, but for centuries.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean, it seemed to me that we're seeing on the one hand the media presenting basically the Putin is bad, Russia is bad, very one-sided picture, and therefore Ukraine is the princess to be saved from the dragon by St. George of the West, in the form of Joe Biden and Ben Wallace, and satellites. So that's one picture, and then on the other side we have another picture which I've noticed, I'm sure you have as well, in what you might call the alternative or the truth or freedom or dissident community. There sometimes, not always, but sometimes we're seeing a message or an interpretation whereby, well, Russia and Xi Jinping and Klaus Schwab and Joe Biden and Rishi Sunak, they're all in the same bed together. They're all in the same club. They're all doing the same thing. It's basically them against us, the people. And they're all as bad as each other. And so the war is either fake. I've even seen people saying, it's not happening at all. It's some kind of scam, a kind of wag the dog story. Or else it's not a real war. It's a kind of pretend affair. And the purpose of it is to scam us all and basically to take us further along the road towards, for example, Schwab's Great Reset or the latest phase of the New World Order. So there are these two very opposite pictures. And you probably come across this debate also, which is about the multipolarity interpretation. The people are saying, well, we're moving into a multipolar world, and some of them are in Russia. And then there are those who stand up for the international rules-based order, which is basically the unipolar world of American domination since World War II. And again, those people who see that this war is some kind of fake or a pretend affair will argue that, for example, well, multipolarity is just as bad as unipolarity. So that's another aspect of it. But they're basically saying the same thing. Both sides are as bad as each other. And in the book, I've tried to argue, well, actually, it's not so simple. It's not as cut and dried as that. It's not as black and white as that. The situation is quite complicated. And as you say, Phil, you've got to go back several centuries at least to see where this really originates in the struggle between the English-speaking people and the Slavic-speaking people, particularly the Russians.
Yeah, so I mean, you spend a lot of time in the book talking about the modern era. You touch on the Napoleonic Wars and the impact that they had. First World War, obviously, is a huge thing. How far back do you go with the story of why this is happening today?
I think really, practically speaking, you've got to start somewhere. But practically speaking, I would go back to the Napoleonic time. Because there you can begin to see quite directly the beginnings of, on the one hand, British interference with the destiny of Russia, and also British fears about Russia. And the third chapter in the book is specific. There are only four. The third one specifically deals with the 19th century and the development of British fears about Russia, which are essentially about fears of Russia taking India away from the British elite. But behind that situation, which, as I said, arguably we can start in the Napoleonic time, of course, you could go back even as far back perhaps as the 9th century. And I'll just say why very, very briefly, which has to do with, at that time, you could say that the European situation was such that Europe was basically still governed by the thinking and the habits of the Greco-Roman world. And the Germanic peoples, who basically have been in the driving seat of European affairs, especially since the 15th century, the Germanic, that's Germanic, not German, but Germanic includes German. It also includes English, of course. So they were still in an early phase of their development in terms of civilization. They were still in the tribal phase. As you know, the Romans and the Greeks regarded them as barbarians. So in the 9th century, that's a very important point, because there, for example, although the Greco-Roman ideas, the Latin ideas, which are very much informing the Catholic Church, for example, and the papacy, we see rather there the Holy Roman Empire gets going in 800 when the Pope crowns Charlemagne.
Yeah.
So you have a German Carolingian king, still pretty primitive. He now becomes the Pope's chosen defender. So the Germanic peoples now take on a specific role within that Greco-Roman Latin cultural milieu, so to speak. Yeah? And the Germans were then educated by the church, and they look up to or they're trained to look up to the papacy to train them in the ways of civilization, so to speak. But in the same century, we also see the Slavs, or particularly the Rus, appear when Swedish Vikings land in Russia and establish the proto beginnings of a Russian state. So in the 9th century there, I think we can see the emergence of this polarity between the Germanic peoples of Central and then Western Europe, Northern Europe, and the Slavs, the Russians in particular, in Eastern Europe. And that'll be important because after the 15th century, the Germanic peoples in Europe basically take over the vanguard, if you will, or they they increasingly push out the Roman Latin-based cultures from a position of dominance in European affairs. And that's still the same in our time. And at certain points in the book, I go into the more esoteric aspect, or the more esoteric view of history, which says that, well, this Germanic phase of leadership, if you will, within Europe will pass over to the Slavs in the normal course of things, so to speak. So we've gone from Southern Europe and the Mediterranean era over the last 2,000 years, then into the Northern and Western European region, the Germanic region, and then in the future, the vanguard position will move to the Slavs. Yeah? That's an esoteric understanding of it. And the people who run the Western elites know this, and they're determined to make sure that it doesn't happen. So that the next epoch, if you will, the next phase of history after this Germanic one, which basically is supposed to begin in the 4th millennium, that will not happen, because the Germanic period, which basically means the Anglo-Saxon or the English-speaking epoch, because the English-speaking elites will have tried to make sure that the Germans don't get a look in. And we saw what happened in the 20th century. They will try to make sure that the Germanic cultures continue to dominate in the next epoch as well. So the Slavic culture, with the particular talents, if you will, or characteristics that they have, will not be allowed to come through. And that's a sort of esoteric underpinning in a very big perspective of what this war is about. It's the effort to take down the most prominent, the most powerful, the most successfully growing, in a certain sense, culture within the Slavic world. So that's how I would see it in the big picture sense.
Yeah, going back to going forward to the Napoleonic era, you mentioned this desire of the Anglosphere, as it existed at the time, to prevent the Germanic peoples and the Slavs teaming up together.
Yeah. That became especially an issue really more at the beginning of the 20th century, or towards the end of the 19th century. Yeah. But at the beginning of the 19th century, of course, it was, you could say, France's last big hurrah, which is basically the last big hurrah of the Roman Latin cultures in the effort of Napoleon to conquer the whole of Europe. And as we know, that was, as with the defeat of Hitler, that was largely defeated due to the Russians, with the failure of Napoleon's invasion of Russia.
Right, so it's kind of like a supporting role for the British forces and the Austro-Hungarians. Like, I remember, it's a while since I've read any Napoleonic history, but I seem to remember that the British Empire was sort of, they got a foothold in Portugal. I think it was in Lisbon. And then they were sort of moving eastwards across Spain and harassing Napoleon from the west, if you like, while he was trying to hit Moscow.
That's right, yeah. And at the same time, of course, the British were financing all these coalitions against Napoleon, yeah.
So Britain would have been the major financial power at the time, would it have been?
Yeah, it was certainly becoming that, yeah. So in a certain sense, you see, although the British were indeed fighting in the Peninsular War, in Portugal and in Spain in particular, it's a bit like now that they were, or in the first years of the Second World War, for example, because as you know, Churchill made sure that the Russians fought the Wehrmacht for 4 years nearly, 3 years before the Americans and the Brits went across to Normandy. So there's a sense in which in the Napoleonic era too, the Brits were kind of holding back, but it really was mainly the Russians who that was mainly accounting for the weakness of the French army.
Yeah, and it was a case of the British Empire letting that happen, if you like, letting France or Napoleon exhaust himself against the Russian forces in the east, and then sort of sweeping up the bits and taking the credit. I mean, what happened to Russia at the end of the Napoleonic Wars? In what was it, 1815? Was it Napoleon was defeated?
Well, an interesting thing before he was defeated was, of course, and the reason why I kind of start back then, is that the British played a role in the removal of Tsar Paul I. And Tsar Paul I allied himself with Napoleon because he was very unhappy that Nelson had taken Malta and wouldn't give it back.
Right.
And he was the Grand Master of the Knights of Malta, which is a Catholic order, but he was the Orthodox head of it. And so he was a very strange figure, Tsar Paul, quite idiosyncratic. And anyway, he was very annoyed that that Malta was that his Malta, so to speak, was no longer accessible to him. And so he allied himself with France, and Napoleon, who'd already tried to get at India, which he rightly saw as the basis of British economic power and world power, British control of India. That's why Napoleon had invaded Egypt in order to head over to India. But that had failed, again, largely due to Nelson, the Battle of the Nile. So Napoleon then, when Tsar Paul lined up with him, suggested that they go after India together. So Paul immediately said, right, I'll send an army over to India. And he launched straight away, I think it was 20,000 Cossacks heading across the deserts towards India. Well, you can imagine what the government in London thought of that. And a few months later, Tsar Paul was assassinated by some Russian aristocrats. One of the assassins, his sister, was the lover of the British ambassador, and there seems to be some strong suggestions that the Foreign Office was involved in that. At any rate, even if there wasn't solid documentary evidence that the Brits were involved, it certainly did benefit the British very much, because the Tsar's son, Alexander, was a good friend of all the assassins, and he was even in the palace when the Tsar his father was being assassinated, and he apparently had wanted his father to be removed but not killed. So, he was prepared to take over from his father, but he didn't think that his father would be murdered. So he did take over from his father. He didn't punish any of the assassins. And then he became best friends with the Brits for a while and received British money for the coalitions and so on. And then, that virtually continued really until the defeat of Napoleon. So after the defeat of Napoleon, to begin with, when he was a younger man, the Tsar was a little bit, by Russian standards, a little bit more open to what the British in those days might have called liberalism. But by the time of the defeat of Napoleon, he'd become very conservative and also very religious as well, and very orthodox. And so Russia, from 1815, defeat of Napoleon, Russia became a very conservative state. And from that point on, both liberals and conservatives in Britain began to see Russia increasingly as a potential enemy, the country that could now, because France was out of the picture, now the country that could possibly take away India, the goose that lays the golden eggs for Britain, from British power.
Right, and I guess part of it is just because of the sheer size of Russia. It's a large population. It's got a lot of natural resources. Thinking back to Napoleonic era, well, even today, we talk about the natural gas and the oil and the timber and grain. I mean, that's another great point you make in the book. You talk about the fear of the Brits, the British fear that this massive powerhouse of a country might align itself with a smaller but more maybe technologically savvy or industrialized country like Japan or Germany.
That's it. Yeah. Yeah. As you said earlier on, I mean, that's the fear. So you have these two fears on the part of the British elite. The first is that Russia could take India away from the Brits. The second fear is that Russia could link up with, as you've just said, a very energetic, disciplined, well-ordered, and pretty well-educated country like Germany in particular, or even Japan. And the British were determined to prevent that.
Now,
sorry, go ahead.
So I was just going to say, well, Germany doesn't exist at this time, does it? It's still isn't it? After Napoleon, it's still like a confederation of...
Yeah, and then in 1871, it gets unified.
Right.
And then, of course, German industrialization proceeds very, very rapidly in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s. So by the time of the 1890s, the Germans were already outstripping Britain, even, outselling Britain, even within the British Empire, even within the colonies.
So is this a byproduct of the Franco-Prussian War then?
Yeah. It was the last of Bismarck's three wars,
right.
And that's what succeeded in uniting Germany. And Germany's sort of big mistake, or tragedy in a sense, in the 19th century was that the Germans were too overawed by British material power. It's hard maybe for us now to realize how strong Britain seemed, at least, to foreigners in the 19th century. I mean, this tiny island dominating such a vast amount of the world, with its huge navy, its incredible finances, its gold standard, it seemed amazing to continentals. And the German middle class in particular, they said, well, we'd like some of that. And so they envied the British. They envied the Navy, for example. They envied the colonies. And so when Germany came together in 1871, the middle class in particular, the business class, the industrial class, the commercial traders, these people gradually got together with the aristocracy, the Junkers, the landed aristocrats, of whom Bismarck was one, and pressed for German colonies, a German navy, and basically they began to copy, in effect. Instead of being themselves, instead of being German and doing what Germans do best, so to speak, they began to say, well, let's put our energies into copying the Brits. Just as in a certain sense, the Prussians in the 18th century had copied the French by developing the French army, the French military power, the French bureaucracy, the French sort of statism, if you will. Yeah. The Prussians had copied that in the 18th century. Now in the 19th century, the new German Reich Empire wanted to copy the British commercial economic empire and the ways in which that empire was underpinned.
And I was reading about the Hanseatic League a while back, which is further back in time, but I'm guessing that was the same sort of area, wasn't it? Sort of Poland, Germany. And that was more of a sort of commercial union that maybe, I don't know, did the fledgling German state, did they read much history and sort of learn any lessons from them maybe?
Well, yeah, they certainly read history, but unfortunately, many of them took the wrong lessons from it. And as I say, they were so impressed by the British that they just wanted to copy the Brits. And of course, this goes on right up until Hitler and the Second World War, because Hitler never wanted to fight the Brits. Never. He was a great admirer of the British elite. And I emphasize the elite and the ruthlessness and the racialism of the British elite. He admired that. And he wanted some of that for Germany, which is why he wanted to invade Russia and create his own British Raj for Germany in Russia. So the Slavs would be the Untermenschen, like the Indians were in the Raj. Yeah. So he didn't want to fight the British. So, and that really started at the time of Victoria, whose husband, after all, was German. And as you know, the Kaiser Wilhelm I, he was half English. His mother was English.
They were all related, weren't they?
Yeah, they were all related. Yeah, they were all related.
Yeah.
Basically, yeah, the Tsar as well, through Victoria's family.
That's
really.
right, yeah. I mean, before we get to World War One, we mentioned Japan before, and you make an interesting case about the Russo-Japanese War, which was shortly preceded World War One, and maybe some British meddling going on there. Oh,
definitely. And there it begins to be not only British meddling, but Anglo-American meddling. Yeah, so the British and the American elites are now coming together. In the 1890s, those two elites really started to merge, even in the bedroom, where you get lots of very rich American heiresses begin to marry rather cash poor English aristocrats. Yeah, well, the Churchills, for example. His mother was American, Winston Churchill, and so it's the British and the Americans decide that they want to muscle in on the potential of China, the economic potential of China, the open market of China, and they're determined to keep the Russians out of China. But again, neither of them have much of an army that they can put in the field against the Japanese, who again had modernized very, very rapidly, like the Germans, very organized, and very sort of up for it, so to speak, very patriotic and already quite militaristic. And so the Americans and the Brits didn't have an army to put in the field. So they basically put the Japanese army in the field. That's not to say that, the Japanese wouldn't have liked to go themselves. They certainly would. But they too were copying the British. In order to be modern, you had to have an empire. That's what the white peoples have got. That's what we want. So they wanted an empire. And the nearest they saw was China and Korea and Manchuria. Coal, steel, iron, these are the things that you need for a big military. And Manchuria and northern China had these things. So the Japanese wanted that. So they had their own motives for going in, copying the imperial model of the West. But the British and the Americans financed them. The British built their battleships. With those battleships, the Japanese. Yeah, the Japanese sank the Russian battleships, which you probably know went all around the world. The Russian Baltic Fleet sailed all around the world, only to be wiped out by the Japanese, largely with British battleships. So the Japanese emperor gave, I think it was the Order of the Rising Sun, 3rd class, to Jakob Schiff, the American financier, for financing him. So in a certain way, Phil, you could say that, there's a certain similarity of what's going on now. Is a proxy war whereby the Japan is the battering ram against Russia. Now Ukraine is the battering ram against Russia. Behind Ukraine, behind Japan, in both cases stand Britain and America.
Now, before we come to the present day situation, because we've been going forward, haven't we? We started with, the Northmen, the Normans, the Norsemen, and then we've gone through Napoleonic era, and then Russo-Japanese War, which is only a handful of years before World War One. But we should talk about World War One. I mean, I would love to do an entire podcast with you, Terry, just on the start of World War One, because I think it would be pretty fascinating.
Yeah, sure. We can certainly do that. But maybe, Phil, before, if you don't mind, before we get there, there is just one thing in relation to this connection with the Americans and the British coming together. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And that's hang on, I just like to sort of quote you something from the book, which is a quote by a member of the American elite by the name of Brooks Adams. Can you see that? Mm-hmm. Yeah? Is that clear?
Yep.
Okay. Now, Brooks Adams was a member of the American elite of what's called the American Gilded Age. He's right up there with the plutocrats of the American establishment. Yeah, and he and his brother Henry Adams wrote some very interesting articles and books, and they were friends with all the people in American governments, and like Theodore Roosevelt and the secretaries of state and so on and so forth, and the big bankers and the Morgans and so on. But these are the thinkers. These two brothers were two of the prime thinkers in the American elite at the time. I'd just like to quote you a couple of things that he said. So, for example, Brooks Adams, he'd written a book in 1895 called The Law of Civilization and Decay. And in that book, he said that there are young peoples and mature peoples. And the young peoples are imaginative, inwardly creative, and warlike. And the mature peoples are sober, scientific, and commercial. And he considered the Russians to be the first kind: young, imaginative, warlike, immature. And he considered the Anglo-Americans to be the second kind. So the Russians were backwards, so to speak, and the British were progressive because they were in the driving seat. So where did he go with those ideas? In 1900, he said the following: that the world would be divided in two poles by 1950 by the power struggle between the sea-based system of the USA and the land-based system of Russia. Quote, Americans must recognize that this is a war to the death, this struggle between America and Russia. Remember, they weren't even at war yet. It's a struggle no longer against single nations, but against a continent. There is not room in the economy of the world for two centers of wealth and empire. One organism in the end will destroy the other. The weaker must succumb, unquote. And he felt that the key to victory between Russia and America lay, quote, in the development of China, which is why the USA has to do everything to bring China under its own economic control and reduce it to a part of our economic system before Russia and continental Europe gain possession of Chinese markets. So this idea became the center and the theme of his book, America's Economic Supremacy, in which he prophesied the fall of the British Empire and its replacement by the USA. So the American elite were already planning, you see, that they would take the British Empire into receivership, so-called. That's what they actually called it already in the 1940s. And in his book, his next book, The New Empire, in 1902, where he forecast the rise of the USA to world power, he said this was inevitable, and within the next 50 years, the USA would outweigh any single empire, if not all empires combined. So there you have the beginnings of this notion, which the American elite have at the end of the 20th century, the unipolar American order. Yeah.
Yeah, one superpower.
Yeah,
since
1900.
Since the end of the Cold War. So it's predicting the Cold War and the aftermath of it, if you like, 100 years in advance.
Yeah, the aftermath when America is totally dominant, indeed, yeah.
What do you make of a lot of commentators at the moment are raising questions about the BRICS countries? What is it? Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and that this could create a duality because America seems to be on the decline. Their debt is astonishing. The fact the monetary system seems perilous, and that there could be a rival sort of conglomeration of the BRICS nations.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things maybe to that. One is that, I mean, the British elite were already worried at the end of the 19th century that Britain was becoming weaker. They were very worried about Germany and Russia. And the reason they got together with the Americans, having seen that the America was not going to split up in the Civil War, the British elite had wanted the Confederates to win, many of them, and that America would break up. When they saw that wasn't going to happen, then it was a case of, well, if you can't beat them, join them. Or if you can't divide them, join them. And so they said, well, the only way we're going to survive, or at least keep our dominance for the coming couple of centuries, if not several centuries, is for us to get together with the Americans. So that's what they did. However, although they were already worried about their weakness in, say, the 1890s, I mean, as you know, India didn't go until 1947. So, and the British Empire really had not more or less gone until the 1960s. and Hong Kong, of course, dribbles on until 1990. What was it? 1999. So, you know, it took another 50 years or so before the British Empire finally, in outer terms, I mean, there are those who would say, well, it metamorphosed itself into a financial empire, you know, in places like the Virgin Islands, the Bahamas, and the spider's web of those kind of.
Yeah, and an empire of influence through NGOs,
Exactly.
think tanks.
Exactly. Run through the city of London.
Yeah.
But in an empire in the outer sense, you know, with troops and naval forces and all the rest of it, that had gone. But it took half a century. And then if you look at the example of the Roman Empire, which the British and American elites are so often over the last 200 years have looked back to and seen as a kind of model, well, that took a long time to die. Even though, you know, say by the 3rd century, definitely it was on its last legs. And some would argue even by, say, about 200, 250, it was already showing severe signs of weakness. But, you know, it was in the West, at least, it was 476 before it finally gave up the ghost. Yeah.
And then another 1,000 years in the East.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, in the East. So, you know, that's why earlier, as I said, the Greco-Latin epoch really kind of struggles on until the 15th century with the fall of Constantinople and the end of Byzantium. So in that sense, the Americans, although many people are saying they look weak, they could struggle on for some time yet. And many Americans are aware, as you know, that once the dollar goes as the world reserve currency, then they will be in big trouble. And that, of course, is one of the reasons why the concerns about the BRICS. Because if the BRICS manage to keep together, then the dollar as reserve currency indeed is under very, very great pressure. But if America could, for example, within the next 10 years, take out Russia and China, I know that seems like a tall order, but just imagine if America could take out Russia and China out of the BRICS, then, you know, and possibly even if it could, in order to take out China, if it could, as it is now trying to, draw India into its own orbit, then the BRICS would, I think, cease to exist as a serious challenge to America's continued dominance.
Yeah. It's difficult, again, going back to sort of our Western perspective, when we turn on the mainstream news, we get the impression that the entire world is with us. But if you spread your view a bit broader, you find that it is just the Anglosphere and Western Europe.
Yeah, that's right. The Anglosphere and its satellites. Of course, it's got some satellites which are not, you know, Japan, South Korea, Philippines, unfortunately, seems to be. You know, and who knows, as I said, you know, maybe they might succeed in drawing India in. They might even succeed in drawing Vietnam in. You know, there's no love lost between Vietnam and China.
And Vietnam are poised to take over from China on the manufacturing front as well.
Well, yeah, and look at the economic links which the US is now developing with, you know, has been developing with Vietnam. So, yeah, there are, as you say, a lot of the world is not on America's side, particularly in this present conflict. They're either quietly, maybe hostile is a strong word, but they're quietly antipathetic, or they're just staying out of it, being neutral. But there are some who are indeed very much still on the American side. I mean, just think this last week, the South Korean leader was in Ukraine and promising to do all he could for Ukraine.
So, I don't know, should we go, is it worth going to World War One? We've got about 20 minutes. Yeah. Or do we want to go fast forward to sort of the last couple of decades or from the fall of the Berlin Wall? I don't know. It's up to you, Terry.
How much more time have we got?
Got about 20, 25 minutes.
Okay. Well, just to maybe very, very quickly, just a few little pointers. I think a very important person to keep in mind, if your readers are not aware of him, is somebody who is not very well known. He's managed to keep himself under the radar, so to speak, of many people, but really deserves to be much more well known. And that's Alfred Lord Milner, the founder of the Milner Group, which took over from what Cecil Rhodes set up, in the early 20th century. And the Milner Group then basically was the group that would later transform the empire into the Commonwealth, so direct rule into indirect rule, and also supervise, you could say, this whole process of bringing together the British and the American elite. And for example, something like the Council on Foreign Relations, this very important American think tank, which comes about after the First World War, and Chatham House, the British think tank, or Royal Institute of International Affairs, same thing. Those two sister organizations, their coming together was also organized by people in the Milner Group. So Milner himself died in 1925, but he's a very, very, very significant figure. He even suggested at the end of the First World War that Germany should be split into two, and that the Bolsheviks, the communists, should be allowed to have the eastern part. And he even fingered the guy who should be the ruler of the western part. And that was Konrad Adenauer, who in 1919 was the young mayor of Cologne. And of course, in 1949, he becomes the president of the Western-controlled Western Germany, satellite state.
Wow. So
Milner already saw, this is the guy we need to control Western Germany for us, and so he's a very significant person. And then he's also the person who turns up a month after, weeks in fact, after the assassination by the Brits of Rasputin in December of 1916. Rasputin wanted peace at virtually any price, really. He was rather pro-German, close to the Tsarina, who was German, and he thought war would be disaster for Russia. He tried to prevent the Tsar from going to war, but he was attacked just before war broke out, and so it was a near fatal attack, and so he was recuperating and so unable to influence the Tsar at the time in 1914. So he was out of the picture. He came back then, he recovered, came back, and was able then to influence the Tsarina when the Tsar had taken over the general staff of the Russian army and was away from Moscow, from St. Petersburg and from Moscow. So so the Brits assassinated him. It's usually said that he was killed by Russian aristocrats, a guy called Yusupov, Prince Yusupov. But if you read the very interesting book by Andrew Cook called To Kill Rasputin, you'll see documented that it was actually Oswald Rayner, a British MI6 agent, who fired the final shot into the forehead of Rasputin, which finished him off. And Oswald Rayner supervised, with the assistance of the British ambassador at the time, supervised the whole assassination project. So Rasputin was taken out. And then, by the way, the British were only allowed to know that 80 years after the event, when the British BBC did a documentary on the thing in 2004, I think it was.
Yeah, a bit like JFK, isn't it?
Exactly.
They keep locking it up.
Exactly. And then Milner turns up in Russia on a kind of study survey, so it was called, to see if Russia could still hang in the war, because Russia was a bit wobbly by that time. And he goes back to Britain, but not before he's dispensed millions of rubles to various members of the Russian elite and also the Russian army to overthrow the Tsar and bring about the February Revolution, or actually the March Revolution. The calendars are different. But he went back to London and he said, no problem in Russia. The Russians are still on board. They'll keep fighting. And then only a few days later, the revolution broke out, and the Tsar was out. And so he played a big part in overthrowing the Tsar and bringing about the first revolution. And then the Americans and the Brits made sure that the Bolsheviks would come to power in Russia. The main guy who ensured that the Bolsheviks would win the civil war was Trotsky, not Lenin. Lenin was the ideas man. Trotsky went out there in the field and did the organizing. And Trotsky was brought to Russia by the British via New York and Canada, from Spain. So, you know, that again was the British got him there. And then the British and the Americans, with their money, made sure that the Bolsheviks were financed, made sure that the whites, the Tsarist, pro-Tsarist whites, failed in the Russian Civil War, didn't supply them with enough money and weapons. So the whites failed, just like Chiang Kai-shek failed after in the Chinese Civil War because the Americans didn't provide him with enough support. And so the Bolsheviks succeeded. And then the Americans persuaded, the American backers in particular, persuaded President Wilson to support the Bolsheviks, or at least not interfere with them. And then after the Bolsheviks had established themselves, then the American capitalists moved in and actually began to fund the buildup of of the Russian industry. And you probably, maybe you've come across this book by Anthony C. Sutton.
Oh no, it's one I need to read though.
Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution. All of this is detailed in really excellent detail. And so that's in a very, very condensed nutshell, what happened in the First World War. Milner also produced a plan to divide Russia between the British and the French, but that didn't work out in the end because the Bolsheviks were a bit more successful than even he had imagined.
Well, there was a concern they might even get into Germany. There might be some sort of communist mind virus infect Germany at the time. Yeah,
but as I said earlier, Milner was even prepared for that to happen. Yeah, so he's prepared to say, well, we'll leave Prussia and Eastern Germany to the Bolsheviks, to the Reds, but we must keep hold of Western Germany.
So, I mean, let's move forward to the late 20th century and the current situation, because there's so much going on, in the last 20 years, and we should talk about it. Yeah. So, what was the event in 2004 in Ukraine?
That was the Orange Revolution. So that's where that's where you start to see Soros moving in, and you start to see what the first of these color revolutions, where all of a sudden everybody's wearing orange and t-shirts and banners and flags, and a lot of money was moving there, and that brought in Yushchenko. It made sure that that the sort of more pro-Russian candidate didn't get in, and Yushchenko, the more pro-Western candidate, did get in. And at the same time, when Yushchenko got in, you started to see Ukraine moving strongly away from Russia, more and more hostile to Russia. And at the same time, the sort of very ultra-right, ultra-nationalist, hard-right, basically fascist, neo-Nazi types, who you've probably heard the term the Banderites, the followers of Stepan Bandera before and during World War II, who was a Ukrainian nationalist involved in the genocide of many Poles and Jews or his organization was, in Ukraine, particularly in 1943. And Yushchenko made these people into heroes. So, I mean, these were genocidists. These were really, really vile people, and he made them into Ukrainian heroes. And so you see these kind of guys coming out of the woodwork. They'd always been there in Ukraine, even through the 90s, but in the early 2000s, you start to, from 2004 to 2010, you start to see them really becoming very prominent, and all these hard right and nationalist groups, militia type groups, training parading and so on and so forth. Yeah.
And so we've got the expansion of the EU, which is happening around this time, isn't it? I seem to, when I think back to sort of the mid 2000s, 2004, 5, 6, we're starting to get sort of Poland coming in and open borders between joining the Schengen. And so this is the major fear for Russia, is it, that Ukraine's going to be become part of the EU?
Yeah, exactly. And you know, I'm just trying to get hold of another book here just to show the listeners. Yeah, this one. I mean, this is really the key, I think, and you've probably heard of this book, the key to understand what was going on in well, not only those years, but and look at the subtitle. Can you see the subtitle?
American primacy and its geostrategic imperatives.
Yeah, well, that kind of says it all in a way.
Yeah, he was a real character, wasn't he, Brzezinski?
Absolutely. But Brzezinski, again, you see, and I make this point in the book, was working on the English Victorian geopolitical text, if you will, which goes back to a guy called Halford Mackinder, Mackinder, Halford as in the bike company, Halford Mackinder. And he's really regarded as the father of Anglo-Saxon or Anglo-American geopolitics. And he was the guy who really comes forward with this notion that Germany and Russia must never, never, never be allowed to join together. That concept. And also the concept that there is a certain part of the world which he called the Heartland. In 1919, he called it the Heartland. In 1904, during the Russo-Japanese War, he called it the Pivot region. And that this is basically Central Asia and Siberia. And whoever has control of this region has control of what he called the world island. And whoever has control of the world island has control of the world, essentially. The world island is Eurasia, Europe, Asia, and Africa. And whoever has got that controls the world. But the first step to gain control of the heartland, the pivot region, he said, is control of Eastern Europe. So first you've got to gain control of Eastern Europe. Well, we know, for example, that both world wars began in Eastern Europe. Yeah? And then, of course, we also see in Brzezinski's book on, I forget which page it is, 38 or whenever, he quotes Mackinder's threefold motif about whoever rules Eastern Europe commands the world island, whoever rules the world island, etc. Yeah, this threefold thing. It's a bit like 1984. There's a similar, I think, a threefold mantra in there. And Brzezinski's working absolutely to Mackinder's strategic ideas. A bit like Brzezinski, who was like the Tweedledum to Brzezinski's Tweedledee. Kissinger also worked very closely with the Brits. And so in those years, 1990s, this book, The Grand Chessboard, was written in 1997. Brzezinski is really laying out why Ukraine in particular, and as a Pole, he's particularly interested in the Pole, in Ukraine. He's a Pole, he comes from a Polish aristocratic Catholic background, yeah? And his ancestors actually controlled parts of Western Ukraine. He really sees Ukraine as the key to all this, and it's absolutely vital, he repeats this over and over, that Ukraine must be separated from Russia at all costs. And then gradually, Ukraine must be brought into NATO, Ukraine must be brought into the EU. And as you know, during these years, from the 90s, particularly the 95 onwards, NATO does not disband itself, despite the disbanding of the Warsaw Pact. On the contrary, it moves ever closer towards Russia's borders. Yeah? And then eventually Putin says in 2007, look, this has got to stop. He draws a kind of line in the sand with his speech in Munich in 2007. And from that point onwards, the Western media really start pouring on the hate on him. They already started in 2003 when he signaled that he didn't like what was going on in Iraq. But in 2007 at Munich, he says, look, we can't be having this. Yeah? You're just getting too close to us. And then, as I say, the hate really starts coming on, and then he's just seen as a complete nutcase, mafia boss, criminal, Hitler, the whole works.
It's such a clear dividing line. I'm thinking back to 20 years ago, and the way Yeltsin was depicted in the Western media. Cuddly old Boris Yeltsin, he likes a vodka. We don't have to worry about him. He's a bit of a bumbling idiot. Whereas now, like you said, Putin is Hitler.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
This has been going on for a decade.
That's right, because of course under Yeltsin, America in particular was helping itself. Russia's economy was tanking. They were absolutely dire years for the Russian people.
Let's go forward to the Maidan coup then, 2014, because I think it's sort of temporally the closest big political swing in Ukraine, which is affecting what's happening today.
Mm-hmm.
So explain what happened with the Maidan coup.
Right. Well, the Maidan coup was Yanukovych, the chap who lost to Yushchenko in 2004, the more pro-Russian character. He comes to power in 2010. And he starts maneuvering to get a bit closer to Russia. And then, again, the West doesn't like this at all. And a number of things begin to come together in this period. We see, for example, the emergence of Xi Jinping in China in 2013. And already Putin begins to see, well, he gets interested in this Chinese notion of this transport infrastructure reaching across Eurasia.
This is the Belt and Road Initiative. Yeah,
that's right. And Russia and China start negotiating on that. The West sees this. In 2014, in May, they do the deal. It's worth, I think, some 400 billion or something, and it goes on for 30 years. Particularly supply of Siberian gas to China. So that does this with Chinese and Russian economy. So you can imagine how the West saw that at the time, how the Americans saw that. So then they see this more pro-Russian guy in Ukraine as the head of Ukraine, trying to get closer to Russia, which goes against the Brezhnev doctrine, so to speak. Huh? So what then happens is that, as you know, there was again, I don't want to make this sound too one-sided. For example, there were a lot of young people in Ukraine. I would say they would have to be naive. They were not aware of this whole background, but they were kind of liberal-minded, decent, good people, many of them, who did see that, well, we don't really like the Russians too much, and we think we'll have a nicer life if we're in the EU, if we're part of the West.
Yeah.
So they weren't happy with the way that the Yushchenko government was moving, and so they started demonstrations. Nothing wrong with that. It's part of the democratic process in the Maidan Square there in the center of Kiev. But after a while, these demonstrations got worse and worse and more violent as hard-right people, these hard-right ultranationalists who were all absolutely anti-Russian, started coming into these demonstrations, and the violence just got worse and worse until finally it kind of erupted into the worst violence Europe has seen since when? Certainly since the Hungarian Revolution in 1956. Far worse than Paris in 68. I mean, it was just crazy what was going on in Kiev in January, February of 2014. Yeah.
Sorry, have you found evidence of Western agent provocateurs operating during that time?
Yeah. I mean, there's the evidence which the provocateurs were rather out front only because their telephone conversations were revealed to the world, namely Victoria Newland. She was the assistant Secretary of State for Eastern Europe, I think, in Secretary of the State Department in the US. Her famous or infamous phone conversation with the American ambassador, Jeffrey Pyatt, where she tells she basically says, well, these are the guys we don't want in the new post-coup Russian, Ukrainian government, and these are the guys which we must have in the post coup Ukrainian government, right?
Yeah.
And fuck EU is what she said.
Yeah.
That, of course, went viral all over the world. Yeah. Somehow they put a lid on it, as they always do, and the EU leaders all stayed mum, and they didn't even Merkel didn't even mind that the Americans were spying on her mobile phone and so on and so forth, because they're all puppets and satellites. Yeah, they couldn't do anything. But the reality was revealed. Yeah, and then we saw how people like McCain and Victoria Nuland herself went to Kiev in the middle of all of this. Yeah, and Kerry. So there were those people, and then more dubious are the people who did the shooting. The people who Western media blamed for the shooting on the Maidan. I think about 100 people were killed, both demonstrators and police. And it became clear later on, although it was very murky to begin with, that these shooters were shooting both sides. They were shooting at the police and they were shooting at the demonstrators in order to create chaos and confusion. And it became clear later on that these guys were hired Georgian mercenaries, and they were trained by Americans. And if you do some hunting, you'll find that information online. So that came out as well, but it didn't come out for some time.
I mean, the Americans are really experienced when it comes to regime change, aren't they?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It goes back to, well, when does it go back? Probably Mexico, at the beginning of the 20th century.
Yeah.
Or even Hawaii in the when was that? Heavens, 1870s or something,
So this led to the fall of the government, and it's when Klitschko, I remember the boxer, Vladimir Klitschko was being put forward as a potential leader, and so the democratically elected government, you might have, like me, you might have certain misgivings about the democratic process in a country like Ukraine, which is notoriously corrupt, but it was a democratically elected guy who was overthrown during this coup.
Phil. Yeah, it was. And he was, so it was recognized internationally as what they call a free and fair election, right, in inverted commas. Yeah. They didn't make a big fuss about Yanukovych's election win. Even though they didn't really like him. But so in other words, we had the overthrow of a democratic government through this coup, because when the French and Germans went in there, they actually managed to mediate an agreement between Yanukovych and the demonstrators on the street, the representatives of the demonstrations and the opposition parties, headed by the likes of Yatsenyuk and Klitschko. And by which Yanukovych agreed that he would step down later in the year, and then there would be further elections, right? But the hard right guys out on the street, when that was revealed to them, when the deal was done and the deal was actually signed by Yanukovych and the French and Germans, the people on the street, the hard right on the street, refused to accept it. They refused to accept it. They started attacking government officers, and then their allies in the parliament then immediately moved to overthrow the government. Yeah, so it was an absolute coup, and Yanukovych then feared for his life and fled, went to Russia. So it was a complete coup, no question about it. And so, how on earth can the West now talk about, when they talk about continually Putin's illegal invasion? But what was that in 2014? It was an illegal coup. Yeah. But the West immediately moved to support it.
Right. And this had dire consequences for the Russian-speaking Ukrainians, didn't it, in the Donbass and Crimea?
Yeah, and in Crimea, and particularly in Odessa, where some nearly 50 people were burned alive by people who were against the coup regime, were burned alive in the trade union building in Odessa. Again, that was all forgotten. Nobody was tried. Nobody was prosecuted. And as far as I know, still haven't been. So again, what kind of regime is that which allows that kind of mass murder to take place and nobody's tried for it?
So what's been going on in these Russian-speaking areas of Ukraine since 2014, coming from 2014 to 2022?
war, basically.
Because I haven't seen any on telly. I haven't seen any.
No, very little, very little. I mean, to be fair, there were very, very few documentaries. You might be able to find a couple of Newsnight, BBC Newsnight documentaries between 2014 and 2022. But basically, during those years, the war in the Donbass, because the Ukrainian government basically went to war against its own citizens, because of course, although those two so-called republics declared their independence, after 2015 and the failure of the Minsk Accords, which the Ukrainian government failed to abide by, completely ignored, completely failed to abide by them. And the French and Germans, again, did nothing. It didn't hold them to it.
Well, that was Zelensky was elected on the promise that he was going to offer more autonomy, didn't he, to the Donbass and Crimea?
Yeah, he was elected. 73% of the vote he got. He was elected on the promise to bring peace to the Donbass. He did exactly the opposite. He didn't do anything like that. So there's another lie. And then, as you probably know, the guy was basically a comic actor. And if you dig up some of his old footage, a pretty degenerate comic actor. It has to be quite talented. You know, he's a talented dancer, for example. And as far as I mean, I don't speak Ukrainian, but you know, I guess he's probably a decent satirical comic and what have you. But if you look at some of his routines and some of the things he got involved, like playing the piano with his penis and all kinds of things, you can still see all of this on YouTube. It's amazing it hasn't been totally taken down, or maybe it has by now, I don't know, but last time I looked a couple of years ago, it was still there. So if you bother to look into his backstory, it's just, and look at how he's now treated as Saint Volodymyr, and it's just incredible. So and his whole career was created by another billionaire oligarch in any case, So he promised to bring peace. He didn't deliver on that. He lied, essentially. He did nothing. And before him, Poroshenko, he'd received billions of dollars from the Americans from 2014 until he went out of office in 2017, and then more money from 2017 by the Americans until the invasion by the Russians in 2022.
That money's military aid, right?
Not only military aid, also so-called humanitarian aid, money to support the governments, money to pay welfare, you name it. Aid of all kinds. So Ukraine is a basket case without Western support at this point, and has been for a number of years. In addition to the corruption, which, as you said earlier, has been there for decades now. It was already there in the 1990s.
So, I mean,
yeah.
What do you think made Putin cross the border when he did?
Putin?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I personally think that was a big mistake. I think he should have just waited. And I think the world would have seen that the Ukrainian government would have launched a major offensive against the Donbass, the two so-called People's Republics, which had declared independence. And then it appealed to Putin for support. I think he should have just waited and until the Ukrainians had launched that assault. But Putin said that, again, he's on record. You can see the video of him saying that, well, when he was a street fighter back in Leningrad as a young boy in his teenage years, you don't wait. When you're sure that somebody's coming for you and is going to punch you, you get in the first punch. And that's crudely, I think that's what he did. He had good reason, so he thought that it's coming for us. But not only Ukraine is coming for us. Behind Ukraine is the battering ram. And what's coming for us is the West. Yeah, that's from 2014, the West had shown in its support for Ukrainian military, in its support, financial, military support, in all kinds of ways, sanctions and so on and so forth, that the West was coming for Russia. And so basically he felt, well, I'm not going to wait any longer. We're going to move against the battering ram. And that's what he did. And one other thing is, remember that in 2014, the Americans were already looking to take Sevastopol, the naval base. Yeah? Crimea is important predominantly for Sevastopol. Tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Russians died defending Sevastopol in the Crimean War against the British and the French in 1850s. Then more died in the war in the campaigns against the Germans in World War II. You know, that place, a lot of Russian blood has gone into defending that place, and it's the basis of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. No way were the Russians going to give up or allow NATO to replace the Russian Black Sea Fleet at Sevastopol, which Yatsenyuk would have done. The coup regime would have handed over Sevastopol to NATO. Of that, I'm sure. And the American Navy was hanging around in spring of 2014, hoping that, you know, something like that was going to happen. So the Russians now, by their move and taking this land bridge from the Donbass down to the Crimea, they have, as it were, created a solid base of land whereby they can ensure that Sevastopol will not be retaken by the Ukrainians. And then they say, well, in any case, until 1954, it was part of the Russian state. Khrushchev stupidly gave it to Ukraine. So it's only been part of Russia. It only been part of Ukraine for what, 70 years. Yeah.
Well, I mean, we're coming up on, well, we've gone over time, but I've enjoyed listening to you. How do you think this ends, Terry, the situation with Ukraine? Is there any easy ways out where both sides can sort of keep face? The other thing that's distressing to me from a Western perspective is no one is talking about peace. Just more weapons, more weapons, more weapons. How about some cluster bombs? More weapons, more weapons.
Yeah. Well, I think when you look at the sheer amount of money that the Americans have put into this and the amount of weapons, as you say, and the degree to which they're prepared to support, to which they're prepared to see the Ukrainians die for them, yep, then you realize, I think, Phil, you know, how much is riding on this and how important they think this is to take down Russia. And after that will come China. After that, they will look, if they succeed in taking down Russia, in weakening Russia to the point where Russia either breaks up from within, which is probably their hope, that they could then move to perhaps bring about some situation, maybe over Taiwan, where they can spark something with China. Because I'm convinced that the ultimate goal is to divide China, to divide and rule there as well. Divide and rule Russia so that they can break Russia up into smaller republics, which their corporations can move in on to help themselves to those minerals, important minerals and resources in Central Asia and Siberia. And to make sure that Germany and Central Europe and Eastern Europe, the Germanics and the Slavs, never come together, so that in the far future, the Slavs are not able to do what they should do, and which is basically to, in the future, to replace the culture of individualism, which is the role of the Germanics, yeah, to bring forward individual consciousness. But in the future, the role of the Slavs is to bring forward a new kind of communal consciousness, not the communism of the Bolsheviks, but a new kind of communal consciousness, which will be built on the achievements of the Germanic age of Germanic individualism. So that's what the Slavs have within them, is this capacity, this native capacity to bring forward a communality. That might not look like it, yeah, at the moment, but people, it's easy to look at Russia and see all kinds of ugliness. I recognize that very well. But one can only say, look at the Germanics in the 9th century. Who would have imagined, looking at the Germanic peoples in the 9th century, what the Germanic peoples would be 1,000 years later? Yeah.
Yeah.
So we've got to keep the long picture in mind here and see what capacities live within the folk souls, within the peoples of each nation. And a couple of last points. The Anglo-American elite, Phil, understand that very well. I think many of the ordinary people in the West don't understand it because, frankly, they're not really interested in foreign affairs. The British and the Americans have had ordinary people have very little interest in Eastern Europe. Very few people speak Eastern European languages, not much interest in those countries, far more focused on France and Germany, if they're focused on the continent at all. But the elite are used to sending their specialists into those cultures, or any cultures for that matter, boots on the ground as far as agents are concerned, as far as intelligence people, as far as so-called humans is concerned, human intelligence, yeah? Sussing out what capacities, what lives within the capacities of the individual peoples of the different countries, and then manipulating and using, twisting, perverting, abusing those capacities for the purposes of the Western elites themselves. This the British have been masterly at for a couple of centuries now, and the Americans haven't really got that yet. The Americans specialize in technology. Yeah? The British specialize in guys on the ground, and they're still doing it. So I think, you know, it doesn't look good, but it's really important that we in Britain, for example, or in the West, we look at our own, you know, what lies within us, and try and understand how we are used by our own elites, by things like, you know, the St. George and the Dragon image, which lives very deep within the English-speaking people. Oh, we've got to go off and rescue the princess, the beautiful princess from the terrible dragon. And obviously Russia is the terrible dragon, stroke bull, stroke bear. You know, we've got to turn the Ukrainian bulldog on the Russian bull, stroke bear. Yeah. And that's what we're doing. We as the British people have got to wake up and see how we are used, how we're abused by our elite in COVID, and how we're being abused by our elite now. Is it the case? I haven't been up to date today on the news very much. Ben Wallace has resigned. Is that right? Have you heard that?
Apparently he's stepping down, isn't he?
Yeah.
Yeah, he's stepping down.
I wonder if he's had a crisis of confidence, maybe.
Yeah.
Nah.
Or maybe he's just peeved that he's not going to get the Secretary Generalship of NATO. That man is such a low level, you know, personality, I'm afraid.
He should show more gratitude.
Something even like that. I don't know.
Terry, how dare you talk about my MP like that?
Oh yeah, he's bastard, isn't he?
Well,
anyway, I'm glad he's gone, if he is indeed gone. But you know, we've just all got to wake up and show more interest and realize, you know, it is a complicated story. It's not this black and white picture that I showed at the beginning, where people see, well, they're all in it together, or, oh, it's all the Russians bad and we're all the good guys.
Yeah.
Why can't we all just get along, eh?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Why can't we all just get along? Indeed, yeah. But the thing is, Ben, you know, I mean, if it weren't for the bad guys, who would go and see a play or a movie in which everybody just got along all the time? You know,
boring as hell.
Yeah, spiritual warfare, good against evil. It's the oldest story in the book.
Yeah, I think we got into that last time a bit, didn't we, Phil? You know, what is the role of evil in world events? You know, world development. Yeah.
Well, Terry, we've blown well over time. I've loved every minute of it. Yeah, we should sign off this part of the show. Thanks for joining us again.
Thank you.
Just stay on the line for us for 1 minute while we play ourselves out, Terry.
Right.
And for those of you watching on YouTube, we'll be back in 15 or 20 minutes to do some news on part 2. And check out the links in the show notes if you want to follow up and you know, check out Terry's book and his website and whatnot. Okay.
Yeah. All right. See you soon.
See you soon.
Yeah.